Chris Carlsson. I was born in 1957 in New York City, and I live here in San Francisco. Well, I have an unusual life that I was born of a Danish mother and an American father in Brooklyn, New York, and then we moved to Chicago when I was 2.5, and then to Oakland, California when I was 10, where I lived till I was 17. So I grew up in essentially adjacent to Black America in a way that few white people do. I wasn't fully immersed by any stretch of the imagination, but I definitely always was in classrooms that were well integrated, both on the south side of Chicago and in Oakland, California. And then eventually, that had, of course, a big impact on me because of the time that I grew up in. When I moved to Oakland, it was 1967, which is essentially the takeoff moment of the Black Panthers, and their headquarters was about a mile from where we settled in North Oakland, not far from the Berkeley border. And then I was also a product of, coming of age. Essentially, I was born in 1957, which is the peak of the baby boom. And people think of the baby boom as the people who were born 10 years earlier than me, 1947, because they were the ones who were already 20 years old in 1967, but I was only 10. And so as I come of age, it's really in the mid 70s, which is the majority of us. If you look at the demographic numbers, there were 6.4 million babies born in 1957, which is way more than any other year of the entire baby boom. So there's this big curve, and it goes way up to 57 and then down to 64 afterwards. And so we're the pig and the python in terms of Social Security and Medicare and all that stuff too. But we people my age generally had the experience that we missed it. Like everybody always told us, "Oh, you should have been here. It was really happening 5 years, 10 years ago. Now you're too late. It's over." And that's never been true. But it's easy for people to fall into that assumption that that's really what happened before we had any influence. But the fact is that I came into essentially starts in high school, where I'm a young critical person already because of my job. My early job life was a caddy at the Claremont Country Club in Oakland, where I was carrying the golf bags of the richest people in the United States. Some of them were like the head of Del Monte Corporation or the head of Bechtel Engineering or head of Coldwell Banker Real Estate. And I would have these 4-hour loops through the golf course, carrying their bags, listening to them talk and whatever they were blathering about. And then my coworkers were these so-called Skid Row bums, which were mostly young white guys and older Black guys who lived in SROs, single room occupancy hotels in downtown Oakland usually, and would get their money from the loop. Carrying the two bags, you'd get usually around $14 to $18 over the time that I was doing it in the early 70s. And they would head straight to Golden Gate Fields and bet on horses. But what was funny was that they were really smart. They were really funny, and they were my coworkers. And so I had this kind of class education of people who were considered to be the dregs of society, appearing to my youthful eyes as much smarter and much funnier and much more alive than these zombified, ultra-rich corporate executives who were clearly unhappy and clearly just going through the motions of their lives in a way that was quite alienating to anyone who gave it a thought. So that was an important early experience for me. And then in early high school, I had teachers who had just left their radicalizing experiences at, say, Madison or Berkeley or NYU, wherever they were in college, and they were determined to go into the inner cities to radicalize the kids in the public schools. And so I had teachers who came in with that agenda. And, I made good friends with them, obviously. They were smart and I was smart and they liked me. And I was, for people like that, I was a little bit of a diamond in the rough because I, didn't necessarily get traction with everybody that they came to talk to. But I was extremely receptive. And so I had really influential teachers who, ran. One guy I remember did a little module on the oxymoron of military justice. And this is during the Vietnam War. I mean, we had the oil crisis happening outside of our front window of high school. We could see all the cars lining up to get gasoline in 73, 74. There was a heavy race riot in my school. A young woman was stabbed to death over a cafeteria chair. It wasn't actually it was a Chinese kid that stabbed a Black girl, and then huge race riot ensued for several days. But we were a tiny minority of students, of white students in that school, and we decided after staying away for 2 days that we would just go back. Like it was too much trouble to move to a different school, and we just decided to carry on, and that's more or less how it went. Then these same teachers felt sorry for me, and so they helped me graduate a year early as a junior by doing a special project on graft and corruption in the executive branch of the U.S. government from 1868 to 1968. And this is the summer of 74 when I graduate as a junior, and that's when Nixon resigns, is in that summer. So clearly Nixon was on our mind quite a bit, and we were dealing with the Vietnam War. And one of the classes that was supposed to be the 10th period social studies, the guy had converted it into a 4-hour encounter group where we would go to a different student's house each week on a Monday evening and spend 4 hours from 6 to 10 just discussing values clarification and sex roles and drugs and all the kind of things that were on everybody's mind during that time. So I was the beneficiary of all this, and also, I don't know, not the victim, but just like, it shaped who I was to be a white minority in that world for all that time. And then I went off to briefly to Philadelphia with my parents, who my father got transferred to Philadelphia and lived in Drexel Hills in the suburbs there. And I helped to open 2 malls in 1974 in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I was working at Walden bookstores when I was 17, and that was actually illegal in Pennsylvania. I didn't know. But I became the star employee of Walden Books at the Springfield Mall for a while. It's not too far from Swarthmore, and eventually got pushed out. I mean, we had big fights with the managers right away. I didn't want to wear a tie, all this kind of stupid stuff that they had in mind, and I didn't see any point to it. And they got mad if I was reading a book while I was at work, because I'm supposed to be out aggressively pushing books to customers as they enter. So all that stuff felt really stupid to me. And already at that point, I had a bad attitude about work. It had developed very early in my life. I mean, school was a great training for how stupid and boring modern wage labor would be, and I was well adapted to surviving it, but not enjoying it. And so after 6 months in Philadelphia, then I had already planned to go back to college, and I went back to Sonoma State up in Northern California in Sonoma County, and arrived there in January of 75, mid-year, as a 17-year-old still, and enrolled up there wanting to study philosophy, and particularly moral philosophy. It was very interesting to me. So that was where college began, and then I spent 2 years in college there. Had a big fight with the state of California, who took away my residency because my father's residency had changed and I was underage. I'd only been out of the state for 6 months, been living in California since 1967, but in 1975 they decided I was a non-resident, and lost all my savings, which at that point, today's school charges are so much higher, but in that day, it was a difference between paying $75 a semester for tuition or $750. And I had $1,500 that I'd saved up from my caddying years. And that was absorbed by the first 2 semesters of school. And I had to drop out in order to get my residency established. And I convinced the teachers to let me take classes off the books and then get credit for it in the following semester when I re-enrolled. So I ended up with, a lot of units and finished 2 years, 75, 76 there. And I was involved in anti-nuclear politics at that point. I helped start an anti-nuclear group in the late 77 there. In terms of the interview topic that you're probably interested in, I wasn't an anarchist at that point, but I was certainly curious. I didn't even really know much about it, or for that matter, about communism or the history of the Communist Party or any of that stuff. But I was around people who were in the Communist Party. I realized later, when I got more savvy about all this stuff, I realized that was the case, because there was quite a few old Jewish commies up there in Sonoma County, famously so, around the chicken farms and all this other stuff. Anyway, so I got disillusioned with the relationship problems, but just leave it there. And I left at the end of 76, and I went on a 9-month journey on my own to Europe. And my mother, as I said, was Danish. So I started by spending 5 weeks with my grandmother in Copenhagen in January and February of 77, and then taking off on a trip and spent a month in Paris, living in Shakespeare and Company bookstore, where I read Homage to Catalonia, and got kind of curious about the anarchists and Spanish Civil War, which I didn't know anything about at that point. I was just learning. I turned 20 under the Odeon Theater and then hitchhiked from there down to Barcelona. I went climbing around in Gaudi architectural buildings that today you could never get access to, but at that point you could just open the side service door and walk up the stairway and end up on the roof of Casa Mila. Nobody paid any attention. And so I did that with a friend that I met along the way, and then went to Valencia for about a month, and then down to Granada, and then down to Morocco for a brief time, and came back from Morocco. And in Granada, I got very sick, and I had contracted typhoid fever while I was in Morocco. So I ended up spending 6 weeks in a hospital in Granada, wasting away to 133 pounds and almost dying. Long story. It took him a long time to figure out what I had. And then, but all that time I'm reading a lot, I'm learning Spanish, and I'm so interested in the Spanish Civil War. And I'm reading Hugh Thomas's epic Spanish Civil War book. It was a big, huge brick. And I mean, I couldn't read for several weeks because I was delusional and delirious with fever. But when I could start reading again, that's what I was doing. And while I was in Spain during that period of time, in the middle of '77, that was their first democratic election since Franco had died 2 years earlier. So this is an explosion of reemergent, suppressed politics in Spain. A lot of it Marxist-Leninist, but there was also, the FAI and the CNT suddenly reemerged, and there was publications on every newsstand, on every corner of every city. It was quite exciting for me. I'd never seen anything quite like it. So, long story short, then I just eventually got through Spain and got out of the hospital and went back to Madrid, and then eventually to my grandmother's, and went back home, and then got back to Santa Rosa, California, in September of '77, and I got a full-time job. I didn't go back to college. I got a full-time job at Books Incorporated, and that where I had worked the previous 2 Christmases. And during the course of that fall, we made a lot of money, and the store was very successful. And I was trying to write a letter to the owner of the chain, demanding a full 15% across the board raise for everybody in the store. And I had been knocking on the door of the Retail Clerks Union, which had an office upstairs from us in the mall at Coddingtown up in Santa Rosa. They never responded, of course, like typical unions. And I had been somewhat involved in the U.S. doing support work for the UFW during that period of time, during their lettuce boycott. And that's when I started a group called Sonoma County Citizens for Understanding Energy, and we showed this movie about Seabrook, The Last Resort. And that's when the clamshell alliance in the East had just started, and the abalone alliance in California was just getting off the ground. And that group that I started, which I left them with $78 in a bank account when I moved to San Francisco on the 1st of '78, after I got fired from the bookstore for trying to start a union, that became No More Atomics later. And they were one of the more vibrant chapters of the Abalone Alliance going forward. So I got fired a couple days after Christmas. And then, I was like, whatever, 21 years old, life is easy. I'm just going to move to San Francisco. I wanted to do that anyway. I was sick of living up in Sonoma County. And so I found an ad in the newspaper for a canvasser, could move down and start a job right away. I got an apartment on Hayton Cole for $125 a month for my share of it. And right in the middle of the Haight-Ashbury, which at that point was 50% boarded up, having been quite slumified over the previous decade after the so-called Summer of Love. And then I started canvassing every day throughout the Bay Area, the greater Bay Area, for Citizens for a Better Environment, which was just opening its office for the first time in California. They had previously made their name as a kind of a Saul Alinsky style canvassing operation in Chicago and Milwaukee, dealing with pollution of Lake Michigan. And now they were opening in the Bay Area and trying to do some sort of a similar thing. And I over the course of 6 months, I canvassed just about every corner of the Bay Area and every cul-de-sac and every suburb. Trained a lot of people how to do it because I was very good at it. Turned out I could probably sell broken vacuum cleaners at the door. If you talk fast, you can make money. So anyway, I was making more money than I'd ever made. And then I was also helping to organize the other canvassers because they weren't making any money. And we created a little union moment with them informally where we pressured CBE to pay them a minimum wage for 2-week trial period. They were paying them nothing. They just go out and canvass, and if they didn't make any money, they didn't make any money, which seemed very unreasonable. So during that period of time, I guess that's when 3 Mile Island happened, was right then at the beginning of '78. And over the course of that 6 months, and I kind of got, it was a very radicalizing experience talking to people door to door and realizing that, me trying to get them to sign a fake petition and then give us money, and then in exchange we'd send them a quarterly magazine. While it did address in some ways the issues of water pollution and acid rain and nuclear waste and the things that the organization was addressing, there was really a kind of a project of stasis. Like, give us your money and everything. Our lawyers and scientists will continue to fight, but nothing will change. They'll come back next year and ask you for the same thing again. It was like really obvious to me that that's what it was. And I became kind of critical of the organization because I felt like even though they do good work and they still exist today and they still do good work, and that's nothing wrong with, we need that too. It's just part of the range of activities that people do. But I thought that at that point, I started talking to people at the door about, well, what do you do? And I'd get into these interesting conversations about people and their work. And I realized it's the work that people are doing that they have no control over and don't really understand how it contributes to the mess. But that's what's creating the mess. It's the work we do. That's sort of really basic idea that has really informed my entire life. And so I ended up quitting canvassing in the middle of the summer, and by then I went on another long trip to Mexico and Central America by myself for 5 weeks. And then in the fall, I re-enrolled in college at San Francisco State to read Marx and study Spanish. And so that at that point, in that fall, then I helped start the Union for Radical Political Economics chapter. We started fighting for to get a minor in Marxist studies, or political economy, as we called it. And my girlfriend, who I'd broken up with earlier, and then she ended up moving to San Francisco and living across from me, was basically gay, a lesbian. But she was also a young Jewish girl who had been recruited into the Communist Party. And when I came back from Spain, and then we both ended up living across the hall from each other in San Francisco in early 78, we really could not get along because she was a very dogmatic communist, and I was totally anarchistic at that point, and really thought that, communism did so many terrible things in history. Don't you understand? And she's like, well, how are you? You're so unrealistic. Anarchism can't work. You got to have a party, and you got to do this, and you got to do that. And so we, had an unpleasant separation. And now we've been good friends ever since. But she had to go through her epiphany about the brainwashing of being a communist later in life, which is a separate tactic, a separate tack for this conversation. So by the time I'm getting into the second semester at San Francisco State, I'm realizing that I'm not sticking out. I'm not going to stay in school. I'm wasting my time. It's not interesting to me. I find it quite dull, and I'm mostly having to read things I don't want to read and talk about things I don't want to talk about. And I meet a group. And there's a big protest on the 1 year anniversary of 3 Mile Island in the Civic Center of San Francisco. And I meet a group there, and they're handing out a flyer, and it's really well designed. It has a cartoon on the front of it that's the White House with nuclear cooling towers at each wing. And the title of it is Typeset Professionally. It's not like a Selectric typewriter. I mean, these days, everything that comes out with True Type fonts or PostScript fonts, and everybody just thinks everything looks the same. It's all kind of normal. But back then, in 1979, it was hard to get anything typeset unless you had a lot of money, because it cost money to get real typesetting, and everything came out on a Selectric typewriter. Basically, Courier type was it. So anything that didn't look like that looked darn professional, or press type, where you rub each letter down. That was the other way to do it for your headlines. So I got this flyer from them, and it was called "Nuclear Power is No Accident." I thought, exactly, that's what I've been saying. Exactly, it's not an accident. It's structural. It's built in. This whole logic of the economy needs centralized power, and all this stuff. And so I read their thing, and their name of their organization is the Union of Concerned Commies. And so it was obviously a joke on the Union of Concerned Scientists. So I write to their P.O. box in Berkeley, and they invite me to a meeting, and I go to a meeting in Berkeley, and I meet these really interesting people. And I fall in love with one of the women in the group, and we ended up getting together, and we had a kid in 1984, and we spent 19 and a half years together. She, Caitlin Manning, and I got together, and then we had a few things we did before we got to our big project, which was the kid. No, the big project even before that was Processed World Magazine, which we start working on in 1980 while Jimmy Carter's the president. But before that, the Union of Concerned Commies had been this sort of milieu, as we refer to it, of about 50 different kinds of radicals, including some people who were self-described anarchists, some people who were situationists inspired, some people who were council communists from the 1920s, some people who were, different kinds of libertarian Marxists. I mean, it's just like a really interesting milieu of people, and not that they agreed by any stretch of the imagination. There was quite a lot of vibrant debate, you might say. But I learned a lot through osmosis by hanging out with these guys. I didn't have to read all these boring texts and plow through everything. I could just sort of pick up the arguments from all these discussions that were going on swirling around me. And Caitlin and I then, she wanted to go back to college to get her PhD in history at Brandeis, and she was accepted, and we moved back there in the fall of 1979. And so we ended up living in Somerville for a few months. And it's the only time that I really lived somewhere else besides San Francisco for all these years. And then after 4 months, I had kind of wore her down and convinced her to drop out of college and come back to San Francisco because this is where it was happening. But during that time, we were part of the Root and Branch, which is a libertarian Marxist group publishing the journal of the same name, Root and Branch, with Paul Maddock Jr. and George Shalaba was in that group, and Bill Russell, and a bunch of people. And we kind of were adjacent to and friendly with, or not necessarily that friendly at that moment, with Midnight Notes, who were also in that area in Jamaica Plain. George Kafensis and Sylvia Federici and Monty Neal and John Roos and Peter Linebaugh and all those guys. At that point, we thought they were kind of nutty because they were arguing that the anti-nuclear movement was an example of the working class, a certain fraction of the working class, finding it cheaper to reproduce themselves in nature rather than on the assembly line, which is like, what? It didn't make any sense to me at all at the time. But later, I found their arguments quite compelling, and we've been friends ever since. So that's another long-time connection of mine. But back then, Caitlin and I did our own thing. Also, in addition to Root and Branch, we also made a couple of flyers under the name Glass War, Last War. And we were listening to a lot of punk rock. And I was working in a warehouse where we listened to the Late Risers Club every day, which is, again, part of the sort of anarchist moment in end of 1979. We thought punk rock was part of a revolution. And we didn't know it was the beginning of neoliberalism. That wasn't clear. I mean, we knew that we were up against Reagan and all that stuff, but we just thought Reagan had no chance in hell. I mean, the right wing, Carter was so right wing already. How could anything get further to the right than Jimmy Carter? My God. So after the end of 1979, we moved back to San Francisco, and in February of 1980, there was a meeting of the Union of Concerned Commies, and everybody was very depressed. And it was during the Iranian hostage crisis, and it was the beginning of 11:30 at night ABC newscast called Nightline later. But then those days it was just called America Held Hostage, Day 117. And then the next day was Day 118. And the next day, just on and on like that. So every night, dun, 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 America Held Hostage. And so everybody was talking about that, and we were all kind of depressed. And I said, well, look, why don't we just get it over with? Let's just declare martial law. And so we did. Basically, we all became a theater group, dressed up in surplus military uniforms with oil company patches and Exxon on our helmets. And we did this whole elaborate street theater intervention and all kinds of different demonstrations, and sometimes just by ourselves on busy intersections downtown or on Fisherman's Wharf or over in Berkeley, various places. So that lasted about 6 months, and then it blew up because of the impossibility of those of us getting along with each other in that group, and some really unpleasant authoritarian personalities that I didn't like at all. And it just essentially fractured. And people went their different ways and had some overlap over the years that followed in different ways also, and sometimes hostile overlaps. So then, by then I had already done a flyer with Caitlin in San Francisco because we were temping downtown called Rebellion Behind the Typewriter on one side, and on the other side was the Inner Voice #1. You can find these online. I have them on my on foundsf.org. Everything's there. And so the Inner Voice #1 was an invoice of what the price you actually pay to work in an office. It was kind of, obviously a very satirical thing. and then a serious analysis and rebellion behind the typewriter, which is exactly a precursor to what we did with Processed World. But at that point, the idea hadn't occurred to us yet. So in the late summer of 1980, we have taken off again. I got fired from my job at the Downtown Community College Center for putting a flyer inside of all the calendars for the fall schedule of City College saying that advertising the place I was working at, Fourth and Mission, as the training institute for the clerical working class, where you will learn to process insignificant words and type meaningless letters and fumble around with pointless numbers and add up columns of nothing. And a particular personal message from the director. And then they figured it out after 3 days and they fired me, but I was quitting at the end of the week. And then we left and we went off back to the East Coast, where Caitlin's family has a farm. And we're hanging out on the farm that summer. And I was like, I know, let's start a magazine for people like us who are working in offices who are totally alienated and want to have revolution at the point of circulation. Let's call it The Processed World. Perfect. And then, are you doing the processing or are you being processed? Was the subtitle of it, or the title on the first issue. And so we started working on that in fall of 1980, Caitlin and I and Adam Cornford, and we got our friend Christopher Winks to join us. And our friend Steve Stallone had a printing press. And I, by then, had a typesetting machine. I won't tell you the whole boring story of how I ended up with that, but we ended up in kind of taking over Mark Ritchie and the Earthworks' typesetting lease and took over their machine. And that gave us access to actual typesetting and taught me how to do typesetting, which is what I ended up doing for a living as a small business person for the next I still do it a little bit. But with those machines, I did it for 12 years from that point forward. And that had a lot to do with a lot of things that came later. But the magazine then took off, didn't come out till April of 81. So when we started it, it's before the presidential election of 1980, and we were sure that Carter's getting reelected, and there's no chance that Reagan can win. He's a bumbling idiot. Who would vote for a guy that can't even, have a coherent thought? Well, turns out Americans love people like that, and they keep electing them. So we're never very good at political prognostications, but our kind of sense at the time was that, Carter was this deregulator, privatizer, the first neoliberal president, now we can say in retrospect. And we surely didn't think that, he was gonna lose, because he was so far to the right and doing the bidding of capital already. So didn't they love that? And then he would probably, survive till 84, and then there would be a real social democrat would come in the wake of him, somebody to, wants to build up the New Deal state again or something like that. So again, our ability to prognosticate the future is quite poor. And so then, Reagan's in and Processed World comes out in April of 81. And by the third issue, we have a whole article about him destroying the Patco Union. And we cover the big Blue Shield strike here in San Francisco. So all that stuff is in print, and I'm sure you had a look at some of that already. So the whole run of Processed World's online at Internet Archive, archive.org. Well, I should be clear that I'm not an anarchist. And my attraction to it early on was because I had such a revulsion towards Stalinism and Marxism, Leninism in its wake, and had a pretty sophisticated understanding of what it meant, Stalinism, in terms of hanging out with the root and branch crowd in Boston had been really informative for me. They understood very well how Maoism and Stalinism were one and the same, and the kind of one-party state authoritarianism. And then I'd been around enough personalities on the left, as you suggested, of all sorts of varieties, to know that the kind of fixed dogmatic personality that had all the answers, and they were all found in some Bible, whether it was, some version of Marxism, or distorted one, or Lenin, or anything else, or the Little Red Book of Mao. It's just like, no, none of that ever made any sense to me. I always wanted something more intellectually flexible, something that could actually be nimble on its feet and make adjustments and changes to the world around it. It felt like anarchism spoke to that when I was quite young. But as it turns out, anarchism has the same problem, It's also can be and often is very dogmatic and very narrow-minded and very moralistic and exclusionary, and very much of a subcultural cult-like experience to be in an anarchist group that's formally anarchist. It's had no interest for me either from early on. So what I did to avoid that was I became less and less involved with formal organizations, starting quite early. And Processed World was certainly an organization that produced a magazine 3 times a year for 13 years. But we eschewed any formal structure. So in that sense, we were very anarchistic. Anybody could come into a meeting and have an equal say as all the people that were already there. Like you didn't have to get vetted or have any kind of recommendation of anybody else. You could just be a complete stranger and just walk in and participate. And you could help vote on articles or poems or article or graphics or anything. It was quite weirdly open-ended. And that ended up hurting us because, of course, there's a guy who you may know of or have heard of named Bob Black. And it's a long story about it. I don't think I'm going to give you the whole story because it's really tedious and frustrating. But he had a kind of a criminal genius about finding groups that were the least structured and most easily manipulated by going into them and trying to get laid first, and then attacking the women in the group as soon as he stopped being successful or popular around that, and then letting the rest of the world know that he was the radical revolutionary and that we, and in our case, in Process World's case, me and Caitlin and Adam in particular, were a ruling troika who were dominating everything and had allowed no openness whatsoever, and that he was the real, Bob Black as the outsider was the real radical trying to force us to open up. And meanwhile, it was his job to reveal the truth that we were actually just aspiring union bureaucrats who were manipulating people into thinking that we were open-minded and had any other aspirations. So there's this kind of long history around anarchists where there's this paranoia and the sense that, the way you prove that you're the most radical is by denouncing everybody else for not being radical enough. And that speaks, it warms the heart of young anarchists to hear somebody say, I'm here to tell you the truth about those guys who seem like they're radical. They're not really. They're actually fakers. And I can tell you that because I know the truth. It just works like a charm. And so we lived through 3 years of physical assaults and harassment and legal harassment, getting evicted from our offices, getting super glue in our locks, having our door broken down, having an arson attack on our building, having threats to my newborn child. It was ugly. And the local anarchists in the neighborhood in the Haight-Ashbury at the time were running a bookstore called Bound Together. It's still there today. I'm still friends with some of the people that have been around for the whole time. But as an organization, Bound Together Books, the anarchist collective, voted to remain neutral in the fight between Bob Black and Processed World. And that was ridiculous because there was no fight between two sides. It was one psychopathic human being who was quite clever, using his cleverness to try to destroy us, both physically and legally. He's a lawyer, not everything else. So I lost all whatever left, little remnant I had left that was comfortable being known as an anarchist went away during the early 1980s after that experience, or during that experience. It was like, well, if anarchists can't even take a position on something as obvious as this, what the fuck? And so I've spent a lot of time over the years in organizations that were essentially dominated by the structure of the tyranny of structurelessness, which, as Joe Freeman's article put it back in the 70s. And I've been a beneficiary of it because I have a strong personality, and it's very easy for me to I can be heard, right? I can feel like whatever I care about is going to get heard. I don't have any trouble making myself felt. And that's inherently unequal. It's inherently not an egalitarian situation when you have personalities who dominate like that. And so in that respect, I'm very clear that anarchistic organizations that refuse any formal organizational structures are obviously easily manipulated by the strongest personalities in the group, and usually the strongest personalities in the group also, as I was, are the shit workers of last resort. They actually do most of the work. that actually has to get done, whether it's schlepping 20 to 40 boxes of pages of magazines to be assembled at a collating party. This way everybody comes to this great anarchistic collating party where everybody can show up and get drunk and stoned and put the magazine together and have a great party for a day or two. But in order for that to happen, somebody has to move all those boxes and boxes of paper around and make sure they're all folded properly and organized properly, and then that they all get quality controlled at the end and brought back to the bindery for assembly. And there's usually just me and one other person, or just me. So kind of a combination of odd experiences around anarchist politics over the years. But there's obviously other models. There's like one of the guys in our group for a while, Tom Wetzel, who you might know because he's quite well known as self-identified anarcho-syndicalist and part of the North American Anarchist Federation, that vast organization, and helped start many different organizations. And that he is an organizational fetishist, in my opinion. Like, he thinks that the whole processed world should have had an elected publisher, an elected editor, an elected graphics editor, elected poetry editor, and they should be elected and they should be recallable by, just always wants that model at every moment. And it tends to slow everything down tremendously and become very bureaucratic. So that's the trade-off. And we wanted the nimbleness and flexibility that eschewed those kinds of structures. So, different people produce things in different ways. And there's I wrote a book called Nowtopia in 2008, which is essentially decades after the end of Processed World, or a decade and a half after, trying to really come to sort of understand better my own analysis of radical politics, and that not using the label anarchist particularly, although I think most people would look at what I've written and what I say as being anarchistic. And so in Nowtopia, I wanted to understand, if I believe in revolution, which I do, well, it should be something that you can actually visibly observe, at least the kernels of it, in the behavior and the daily lives of the people around you. And I started looking around and realizing that, yeah, of course, people are doing interesting things all the time. They're actually working really hard when they're not in their stupid jobs. It's exactly when you're not in your wage labor gig, when you actually do real work and you feel like you're really alive and you're human, and you might be doing music, or you might be doing poetry, or you might be creating radical political projects or movements or publications or what have you. And so people tend to work really hard on things that are fully integrated with their humanity, with their sense of who they are. And that is the core of how we're going to change the world. But it also suffers from the problem of small co-ops and small businesses and any kind of small marginal projects, which they're based on cooperation. They're based on a different way of doing things. But as they survive over any length of time, they almost always succumb to the logic of small business, to the logic of paying the rent, of paying somebody some sort of staff wages so they can keep doing the work, the administrative work that keeps the whole thing going. And being able to kind of evolve from the logic of being a small nonprofit or a small arts organization or a small business of one sort or another, even like a small copy shop or printing shop or whatever, what have you, into something that's the kind of the core of a broad scale revolutionary movement to reinvent how we live, how we do everything. It's kind of a leap, to say the least. And so I recognize, there's a book that was written recently called If We Burn by Vince Bevins. It's a very interesting history of the 2010s, in which he analyzed how widely the social movements had erupted throughout the world. There had never been more people in the streets for more reasons than there were in the 2010s. And vast, the millions and millions of people poured into the streets, whether it was Occupy or the Indignados in Spain or, Tahrir Square in Egypt and the Arab Spring. Later in Brazil, the revolt against the transit fares that led to a much wider social movement with millions of people in the street, or in Hong Kong, the revolt against the Chinese Communist Party and for democracy, this is one thing after another. And he talks about the fact that every one of those movements, with almost no exceptions, was taken over by the hard right within a pretty short time, because the hard right was willing to come in and be tightly organized and take orders and exercise power. And almost all these entity, all the things that led to these uprisings. Like he was in the room with 5 anarchists in Sao Paulo who helped launch the transit strike there that becomes this vast social movement that eventually leads to the election of Bolsonaro, of all things. And he says those 5 anarchists, when they realized that their impetus, the impetus they'd provided, had not only succeeded, it had wildly exceeded their expectations, because after several weeks of agitation and having a few small demonstrations, suddenly there was tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and then millions of people in the streets of Brazil, all over the country, complaining about all sorts of things, not just the fares. And they were completely unprepared for that, because it's like, well, we're not in charge. I mean, we just wanted to get this transit thing addressed, and people in movement. Now that they're in movement, they have to organize themselves. They got to do it for themselves. Or in Chile, too, the same thing happened in 2019. They have vast student movements that lead to all these uprisings in all these working class barrios, and they create these councils, these assemblies. Our anarchist fantasy comes true. And 6 months later, it's all fallen apart and disappeared and been taken over by quite different political impulses. So the ability of horizontalist anarchistic politics to organize itself for transformation so far has proven itself fallen short, to say the least. And that doesn't mean it can't someday get better and go further. But in my experience, and certainly in world history of the last period of time, hasn't done too well. Hasn't been able to really go as far as it needs to go. Now you can go back to other anarchist examples, like the Spanish Civil War, vast self-organized unions of anarchist workers who were, of course, in a very different moment in economic history and development and social history and development. But they did a pretty good job of being tightly organized and fought a pretty lengthy two-front civil war against the right and the left, the right and the communists, that is. And, if they'd had backing, who knows what would have happened if they had the support of any place, who might have gone further. But that's an example of where, being willing to be in an organization that has leaders, that has some sort of hierarchical structures that perhaps are controlled through recallable delegates, and all that might be a more functional structure than what we have of the adhocracy of our everyday politics for the last 40 years, which I've been completely in the middle of, which refuses organization and refuses leadership. And so every time we start getting anywhere, because we can't let anybody else make any decisions for us, and we won't be in an organization in which we're accountable for anything, nothing happens. If things happen, but nothing happens that moves in the direction we want it to, because we're not willing to either consolidate whatever gains we might get out of a given rebellion or riot or uprising, and nor are we willing to participate in the dirty work of managing the capitalist city or the capitalist state, which I totally don't want to do. But that's where you can actually take power and exercise power and use power to actually begin to change human relationships. And I'm not sure if there is a place like that that's in another part of life that anarchists could access through some sort of organized process. So far, we haven't discovered it. Well, sure, they have. I mean, I was at Seattle in 1999 for the WTO, and that was a really fun moment and quite exciting and dramatic in the sense of how much that was going to succeed on its own terms of stopping this trade delegations from coming together and creating new world rules for world trade. But world trade went along speedily anyway, in spite of the success of that moment. And there's ways in which the demands of broad-based anti-authoritarian political movements have shaped the left and shaped the world we're in is quite profound. I mean, you would not have this whole tendency to defer to people based on their social and racial identities if you didn't have this anti-authoritarian politics permeating the culture. You would not have been. It would not have been a culture that was so insistent on hearing everybody's voices and giving room for everybody to participate and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's the deep success in the DNA of our culture of anarchist and anti-authoritarian politics. Again, it leads you to a situation, though, where we are right now is a little bit stuck, because people are so bent on defending their niche, whatever it might be, that it's very hard for them to agree to participate in something much broader that goes beyond their immediate demands or their immediate identity or their immediate needs, and says there's a larger dynamic here. There's a larger set of power relations that have to be addressed, and it can only be addressed by a much broader coalition and coalitional politics. And the coalitional politics is quite uncomfortable for most anarchists because they don't want to relinquish their individual control over themselves or their small group. And I understand that because I've been, again, that's me. I've done that over and over again. And I'm still like that. I run a history project with my colleague, and the two of us are it. There's just two people, me and her, and we just have to work it out between us. And that doesn't always work out perfectly either, but it's a lot less trouble than trying to run things by a larger committee. And in fact, we get an awful lot done because we're both highly efficient and we have a kind of a clear idea of where we're headed with the project all the time. We have a lot of agreement about what we're doing. And it's it's an anarchistic project in local history for sure. But if we had to answer to lots of people and wait for their approval for things, nothing would ever get done. Well, I guess I don't know any better than you do or anybody else, to be perfectly frank. Nobody fucking knows. But, we're all still alive. We're still breathing. We're still thinking. We're still scheming. And I do think that there's a good likelihood that there'll be another huge and broad-based explosion of refusal to put up any further with the bullshit that's coming down, whether it's the fascist shock troops of ICE, the ICE soldiers that are now going to be the stormtroopers in our culture, or the petty bullshit that's inflicted on us by local police, or the just complete inadequacy of liberal politics to address the situation we're in. I think that people are really sick and tired of it all, and there will be explosions, but the explosions don't go anywhere. I mean, I've been in really huge, interesting riots, and they're very fun, but they don't constitute themselves as a social movement that could go from the moment of revolt to the moment of, again, consolidation and the building of something different. And that doesn't mean we don't have ideas of what that different world would look like. There's an enormous number of groups and initiatives and experiments going on all the time that really do constitute the technological and social base for a different way of living. Like we have that. It's not that far away. We really have built a lot of it in the interstices of the life we're living. And so can that burst through and help us reorganize life broadly so that we stop destroying ourselves and the planet? Probably not, to be honest, probably not. But it's there. It is a possibility. I do believe in human freedom and that we do have the capacity to radically alter the conditions of life, and we better, because if we don't, conditions of life might alter us and we won't be here much longer. So the old barbarism or socialism point it's still there, and socialism's kind of an inadequate goal, but far better than barbarism. And barbarism's kind of winning the day. It's an everyday reality right now. So we have every reason to be doing whatever we can to throw our bodies on the machines and wrenches in the gears and sabotaging whatever we can sabotage of the fluidity of the ability of the authoritarians to run the world, and really, nurture and bring forth these alternatives that we know are available to us and that many of us have been part of and experimenting with for decades already, and have built what could be quite an alternative infrastructure for producing life with less power, less waste, less bullshit, more joy, more happiness, more fulfillment. We could live really well. We could have a great time. We could enjoy every minute of our lives, or most of them, if that was actually the goal. But it's still only the goal for a very small number of us. And for most people, it's about survival, and it's about, somehow keeping themselves going in the face of really, really confusing input about what things mean and how things are organized and who's in charge and how power functions. And as some person put it, the mute compulsion of the role of capital and money in our lives. Most people are quite oblivious to that, or quite unclear on how it all works. So part of me thinks more education, but then I realize, like, well, you could educate yourself till you're blue in the face, and it doesn't really matter because a large number of people won't read a book anymore and don't even like to read long texts. So where does that leave us? Waiting for the brilliant marketing campaign that shifts everything. That's not going to happen. So I'm still, as you can tell, a big reader. I got a lot of books hanging around behind my head here, and many more in other parts of my house. And I'm a big, strong believer in doing a lot of reading and writing and discussing. And we're not the majority. We're not even a large minority. We're a tiny fraction of the population. But you never know when something breaks and people look for a completely different way of understanding things. They might be ready to try something that makes sense finally, instead of something that doesn't.